This one provides
People, you know what you're growing, you know what you're eating.
Welcome to SCAT Studios in the heart of Somerville's Union Square, in the shadow of the Prospect Hill Monument, where the first flag was flown on January 1st, 1776, under the supervision of George Washington. We're here this evening with a group to discuss voters' rights. I'm Paul Maisano, and I'd like to welcome you to an open discussion about voting, a privilege, a duty, or may even call it an obligation to your country. So tonight we have Christopher, State Senator, not yet? What are you running for? State Senate?
Democratic State Representative.
State Representative from Malden, Massachusetts, Christopher Fallon. Candidate for Congress on the December, nominated by his Republican Party, Frank Adabinola. Good evening. Thanks for coming, Frank. Tina Poindexter and her sidekick, Mel Poindexter. State Democratic Committee individuals for affirmative action, working diligently to get the voters out there, registered, and get them out and participate in the process. I want to thank all of you for attending this evening, and hopefully we can have a spirited discussion so that we can try to entice some of these, I don't want to call them lethargic, but we'll call them sleepers. I think there's a super voter group out there that's just waiting to get involved, and we need to find out what we can do. This is Black History Month also, and because it's Black History Month, we're going to dedicate a portion of this program to Black history and all of the contributions that were given to us from individuals like Dr. Martin Luther King.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
I don't think any of us can be satisfied in the United States until that war is brought to an honorable end and American soldiers are brought back here to the United States of America.
One day, we will have to stand before the God of history, and we will talk in terms of things we've done. And it seems that I can hear the God of history saying, that was not enough, but I was hungry, and ye fed me not.
Those words spoken on April 3rd, 1968, were words of a man who had a vision. And today, 50 years later, we're still working to carry that mission forward. Now, for a moment, if you would, Mel and Tina, can explain to me how we're doing that within the Democratic State Committee and the affirmative action to attract people, young people, and people of color.
Tina and I can tell you that one of the things the party has done and that we're doing constantly is trying to identify those communities that feel left out of the process. So our objective is to try to make those people engage them, make them feel like there's a reason to vote. And that's the thing that we look at across the state, looking at demographically what communities feel like they're not being represented, and then getting them to come out and actually take the time to come out and vote. And Tina and I have taken, as being members of the state party and also being members of the Affirmative Action Committee, that's our mission. That's our mission statement, is to get those people to come out. And we, there's a multitude of things that we try to do in terms of getting people engaged. Multitude.
Yeah, one of the things that we have found is that it's constantly, it's an ever-growing process, because young people will complain about the message, who's running, the candidates, how maybe what's going on doesn't speak to them. So we have to retailer our message constantly to appeal to the younger voter demographics. We also have to tailor our message to a growing immigrant community that once they become registered voters, does our message speak to them?
That's right.
This weekend when we were, traveling around, we were down in Quincy and Brockton, for the Democratic caucuses. We were talking to, several of the representatives. Is our message selling? What is the message? And from what we're hearing, voters, people are registering to vote, but we have to kind of retool our message to be something more that appeals to exactly why did people come to this country and why are they engaging in the process. Right. So that's what we're doing now. That's what we're in the process of doing now.
So registering new voters is part of the process, sort of a process that you go through first. After they're registered, how do you reach them? How do you, is it an issue where you communicate with them through some sort of media or internet, or do you send them a postcard? How's that done? Because what happens, what I've found that happens is many people, tens of thousands, are registered. But when it comes time for the actual action of going out to do something proactive and vote for somebody, they're absent.
Right.
So how do you get from the registration point, to the point where you get them off the couch, out of the cars, or in the workplaces? However you do that, you have a tremendous challenge. Education, I'm sure, about the process is one. Getting them to register is two. How do we get them to vote?
So, something that Tina pointed out, and it's true, is that first it's identifying what appeals to that particular group, because as you know, as you're pointing out, you have immigrants, and immigrants bring, when they come to this country, they're bringing with them their own personal issues, be it from whatever country they're from. For example, in Quincy, you have a large Asian community versus, for example, in Brockton, you have a Haitian Caribbean community. Well, each one they have specific issues that touch them personally. So you have to first identify what those issues are, and then you have to find if it resonates. What you're saying resonates to them personally. Okay, then that's the first step. The second step is registering is one thing, but it's getting them to the polls, and that's tracking that voter, finding out once you get them registered, you have to, in a sense, kind of follow them along the process. Because in many cases, people get registered, like at the motor vehicle, and then they kind of drop off. And people have a tendency to forget that you got to go back and kind of make sure that I registered you, but I got to make sure that you actually know you've got to come out. There's a second process to this. It's not just registering, it's actually coming out and exercising that power to vote. So it's creating a mechanism to follow them from registration to actual voting. That becomes a key thing.
I think, may I?
Yes, Representative.
I think that's a great point. In Malden in particular, each representative, as you know, represents roughly, state representative, roughly about 40 to 42,000 people. My district in Malden, because Malden is so populated that there's actually 3 representatives that represent that city, that population of roughly about 60, 62,000. I have within Malden, just Malden. Other representatives have a little portion of Medford, a little portion of Melrose. My point being that my district got shifted from the Malden-Melrose line, a very, generally a very white section of my district, south towards Everett, Chelsea, closer to Boston. So, because at the beginning of the redistricting process, my district was 60 Caucasian, 40 minority. In the effort that Speaker DeLeo in the House and on the Senate side, Senate President Murray wanted to try to accomplish was to have the districts more equal, if you will, in majority, minority percentages. It's an interesting point you make, because when my district got shifted to the south, it became roughly about a 55-45% district. And I think that's important to your point, because we need to engage all of our minority sects. We need to reach out to them to let them feel that, notwithstanding the members of the House and how many few members of the House we have of minority backgrounds, of minority culture, let alone women as well. We have to do something and keep on doing something along those lines to have people become far more engaged. And I think that was a tremendous effort, even though I believe that redistricting should be accomplished through a citizen-led redistricting committee. I thought the legislature, in particular, Speaker DeLeo and Senate President Murray, did a fabulous job in trying to make districts more minority-oriented. Does that make sense?
I think what he's
That's very
saying is
true.
you're evening it out somehow. It's a broader base, but it's a much more diversified base. That's that's what I'm getting out of that. Let me ask you, Representative, and I wanted to ask you, you're running for the state senate up in that area, if I'm not mistaken, and that now goes from Malden to Melrose, Wakefield, Reading, Stoneham, and a little bit of Winchester, 5 communities in a bit. How are you able to communicate? And I mean, March 4th is your election. So how are you getting people out? What are these various challenges that you're coming up against now that you're in a bigger district and you're in an election that's off cycle?
I'm not sure it goes to the point that the Poindexters were making reference to, Paul. It's very difficult to make, still, notwithstanding what we were just saying among each other and to your audience, it's still very difficult to get people engaged in the political process. And minorities and women in particular still feel, notwithstanding the 13th, the 15th, and the 19th Amendments, they still feel disenfranchised.
That's right.
And I applaud, as a Democrat, I applaud their efforts to network out into those communities to try to overcome that feeling of disenfranchisement. And how am I doing it? I'm just trying to reassure people that we represent all members of our society, regardless of gender, regardless of race, and regardless of sexual persuasion. We try to personally connect with people, honestly, Paul, so that they feel that despite their legislators' skin color or gender, etc., that they still are being represented in a very honest and earnest fashion.
Well, let me digress for a moment. I think what I'm trying to get at, and Frank Adavanola had the same problems, I think, that you have, because Frank, you were involved in the special election, nominating yourself and a couple of other Republicans, October 15th. Then you were going towards a December 10th. And it's much more difficult for a Republican to gather support because, unfortunately, Republicans are a minority. Now, how did you work that out in the field? I mean, what was the strategy behind the Adavanola campaign to say, let's get people registered? Because this is not a partisan issue. This is an American issue. This is an issue that's a problem for this country. And in Massachusetts in particular, if I'm not mistaken, your special election on December 10th, and I'm going to the general, had about 11% of the electorate, and correct me if I'm wrong, and Representative Fallon, you might be looking at the same numbers in the middle of the beginning of March. You might even get a snowstorm that day, Representative. So, Frank,
Thank you for that.
Frank, give me a little bit of a heads up on this. How do we?
We did have a problem on the turnout for the election, and the reason for that is we did have a problem with snow that day. And I heard from some seniors that were concerned about coming out to the polls. So we do have some people that don't historically show up and cast their vote, and I find that that's very unfortunate. So we have a structural problem, and the structural problem needs to be solved by investing more money. And that is a problem that most of us don't like to see occur. And the way we can overcome that challenge is when there's debates, when there's public forums, when the media comes out like tonight and gives an opportunity for candidates to express themselves, and by this dialogue, by this exchange. If we look back in our earlier days in this country, we would be in the town square, one candidate would be speaking, the other candidate would speak, voters could understand and appreciate where their positions are. In today's world, the media has become very segmented. A media goes for a conservative message or a liberal message or some other special interest message, and so we lose that spectrum of exposure for the candidates. So the answer to the question is the media has a responsibility, and the candidates themselves have that responsibility to appear in public, to be available, to answer questions, and to dialogue with the constituents so that people understand that not only do they understand who that representative may be in the future, but in fact that their vote does make a difference. 11% turnout. If I showed up in that election, my vote counts effectively like 10 votes because only a 10, 11% turnout. I have a lot of power at the polls, and people need to appreciate that. Very important to show up to vote.
Well, that's a very good point that you're making. Your vote is much more powerful if only 10% of the electorate shows up.
Right.
You're actually voting for 10 people,
Yeah.
if you think about it. I have to ask you folks a question about absentee ballots. Doesn't anybody use those? I mean, well, that's a great tool. Nobody's talking about absentee ballots. Let's talk about how we can get the ballot to the voter, rather than get the voter to the ballot box. Now, you have a document, I believe I saw one of you had it. It looks like a simple application. It looks like something that can be done. Can you explain that to me, Representative Fallon? Have you tried to use that tool in your campaign on your upcoming election on primary on March 4th?
Absolutely. But just to make a footnote about what my Republican friend just said, I wouldn't put the blame on the media for people necessarily feeling disenfranchised. I think it is, or certainly saying that it's 50% the media and 50% the candidate. I think the candidate and the political process and the political parties, it's incumbent on those three people or entities to make people comfortable in the political process, in the voting process, online registration, same-day registration. There's a lot of other options I think we need to concern ourselves about. And the Democratic Party is out there networking and trying to develop that type of engagement with those that feel disenfranchised. Absentee ballots, Paul, is a great point. People need to realize that when they register, they can also, if there is inclement weather like there was on December 10th, and I think voter fatigue, by the way, has a lot to do with it. Too many special elections.
I hope it ends with you, Representative. I'm exhausted myself.
Well, there'll have to be another to replace him.
No, it won't happen. It's too late in the election year.
160 days
Yeah.
between the time of the election and the new person.
So it's real close though, right?
If I got the calendar out,
I should move to Malden because I would like to.
There won't be because it becomes within the discretion of, in my case, if I move on up to the Senate, God willing, the Speaker of the House has already stated that any special elections to be held after April 1st, he's not going to enforce. He statutorily doesn't have to do that. So April 1st is the cutoff date, and the primary will be March 4th, and then the final election, the ultimate irony, will be April Fool's Day.
Right.
But I think what the Poindexters are doing is the way that we need to accomplish people feeling more comfortable with the political process. Absentee ballots are great. They're a tremendous option, Paul. But along with the absentee ballots, I don't want to use it in the alternative, as you suggested, this process or an absentee ballot. I think we just got to hit all cylinders.
Yeah.
And what
We
they're
have
doing
to.
is phenomenal.
We have to, because I can tell you that Representative is right, because Tina and I, as a party, one of the things we do is we have many, many tools in our toolkit that we try to use to get people engaged. Absentee ballots is one of those tools, okay, but it's used as a means of trying to make sure, catching the people who sort of fall through the cracks. But you have other things that we put in place in terms of outreach organizations that we work with and methods that we use to identify specific areas and groups that are not, that for some whatever reason, don't seem to get captured or motivated to come out to vote. We use many different things to do in terms of online voting. We have things in terms of organizations that have their own mechanisms to try to get people out. So it's always a way of trying to find any way, using the most popular media in terms of tweeting, Facebook, things like that. We're using anything possible just to make sure that people see the importance of voting.
You're working hard. You're all working
Well,
hard.
let me just say this, that, it's, you mentioned absentee voting. We're having trouble just getting people to vote, even if they just stand in line. So absentee voting, it's important. The ones who we find, or the groups that we find that use it more often than not, are the students. Right around the presidential election. They're the ones who, the people who are acclimated to the process and they understand if they're leaving town or they're not going to be, to use the absentee voting process. But getting people to vote in general that's our first hurdle.
Yeah.
And that's what we focus on, to be honest with you. That's what we spend most of our time focusing on, particularly when you're dealing with the various communities who, for some reason, they just don't see, what if I vote, don't vote, it's not going to make much of a difference. And we're trying to get them not to think that way.
Tina,
Showing how important it is.
Absolutely.
It is. It's showing how important. Representing, people remember the areas that vote. People remember who voted, they remember why you voted, and that's something like it's anything else. You know who was there to support you, and that's the thing you remember. And we try to get people to understand that voting is power. Power makes things happen.
We're going to go to a clip in a minute. Before I run to that clip, I'll let them prep that, but we have a clip on voting. Go ahead,
Yeah, I
Frank.
would just like to offer a contrary perspective, and that is that, in fact, with absentee ballots, it offers a real concern. And the reason why it offers a concern is because voting is a fundamental right. That means it's a very important right. And we should do nothing in the system to jeopardize that protection. And what I mean by this is, if we look back recently, we had a special election last winter. The reason why we had a special election last winter in Everett is because there was fraud. There was actually a representative that was on the election commission in this state house, in this House of Representatives, that was forced to resign in a compromise because he was going to be charged. So he stepped aside because, in fact, it was shown, in his example, the feds proved that he, in fact, was suspect to and had participated in absentee fraud. So the point I want to make is every vote's too important. We don't ever want someone to show up at the poll to cast a legitimate vote and find that someone has already voted with that same name. And that does happen. And we need to be very careful that we identify the individual, and it's my right to show up at the poll, and when I show up, I want to make sure that my right is preserved. So it's very important to do the outreach. It's very important to encourage people, and we want to encourage everyone. Get rid of the impediments. Everyone can participate in the process, but put safeguards there to protect this important right.
I think that individual from Everett was dealt with severely because of his infractions against
Absolutely.
the...
Yes,
The
it was.
compromise was he just resigned his seat, but he was not charged.
No jail time?
No jail time. We talk about it in my classroom. My students are astonished that here's a person ethically that has responsibility, and I don't mean to pick on this person because there's other examples, but this is a documented example of voter fraud, and we never want that to happen because, again, it's too important of a right. And if you're at home now watching this video or this presentation, you want to make sure that your right's preserved, and we want to use the mechanisms that people say, encourage you to show up, participate, get engaged, get informed, and show up and cast your vote.
Let me be the devil's advocate. What's more dangerous? Having 90% of the electorate not care or not be involved, or having a little bit of voter fraud? Not that I believe it should be tolerated, but you know, I'm looking to be proactive to get people out. That's the whole idea here. And does it really matter? I mean, you know,
Absolutely
a lot. You know what a
matters,
lot of people say to me?
Absolutely.
This is a train wreck. Why vote? There's nobody to vote for. It doesn't. My vote doesn't matter. I mean, you've heard. Each of you have heard all of the excuses, and you see that even during the presidential election, where there were millions and millions and millions of dollars invested by both candidates, would we get 58%, 60%? I mean, you guys can tell me better. I'm not sure. I don't think it hit 60, but and that was a highly contested, high-profile election.
Well, I don't think we can condone voter fraud. I think we need to use processes that are being talked about here on this panel to encourage people
Well,
to
it's-
exercise their
I
right.
I don't
think
think
that's-
anybody on this panel is
No.
talking about voter fraud.
No.
And by the way, he did 120 days in a federal facility, the guy from Everett. He did do 120 days. He was in there from August to the end of the year, somewhere around December. I forget.
I hope he
the-
learned his lesson, Representative.
I would assume that he did.
Yeah.
We would
Although,
hope that what he did.
Yeah.
But nobody's encouraging fraud here.
No.
What we're encouraging, I think, is just participation in a very honest way in accordance with, you know, the literalness of the Constitution.
Talk to me about how we're going to encourage people by passing legislation. I overheard you say there was a Senate bill that is probably in conference committee or something.
It's being considered and eventually will make its way to the governor's desk if it's not already on the governor's
How is
desk.
it going to encourage people to become involved? Where are the benefits to passing the? I know we're good in Massachusetts regarding opening up the process. They talked years ago about allowing young people in high school the opportunity to register early. Is that in that piece of legislation, Representative Fallon?
I'm not sure about identifying registration. The Senate bill that you're talking about does have an amendment to lower the registration age from 18 to 16. And I think that's, well, it allows people to pre-register at the age of 16. And I think that's a wonderful idea.
Yeah.
I don't think that encourages fraud. I think it gets people thinking about the political process, gets them educated about the political process, and hopefully at such an early age. And when I was 16, even younger, I was involved in the political process with Toby McDonald and with, in '68, that incredibly tragic year in the history of our country with Robert Kennedy. So that was an early age, less than 16 with McDonald, 16, now I'm dating myself, 16 with RFK. And that's what I'm hoping we do with this younger, this next generation. We need to get everyone, regardless, again, forgive me for being redundant, regardless of race, regardless of gender, etc. We need to somehow get people engaged, and it falls on the elected officials, it falls on all political parties, the activists within those parties, to get this done.
And the competition between Democrats and Republicans is healthy. I think it's a great thing to have competition, no doubt. And one of the things I wanted to ask you, if you would just give me a moment to run this clip. I think it's ready, and I'm going to set it up a little bit. It is a little bit outdated. It was the best I could find. It talks about a person complaining that there's no lights in a section of their community. And you watch the clip, you'll see how the person that votes seems to get the result. The person that doesn't vote seems to get no result. I think there's a little message here, and I'd like to run this clip right now. Let's see if this time we can hear it. If not, we'll go over it a little bit. Is that clip ready by any chance?
Hello.
Hello, Mr. Politician. This is Mrs. Travers. I'm calling to see if you can do something about the lights on Arlington Street. They've been out for the past 3 nights.
Mrs. Travers, Arlington Street. You say your lights are out. We'll get to you as soon as we can, Mrs. Travers. Thank you for calling. Why do they think I'll do something for them when they don't even care enough to vote? Hello.
Hi, I live on Myrtle Street, and the lights on our street have been out for at least a couple of nights, and I was wondering if there's something you can do to help me. My name's Joe Carboni.
Mr. Carboni, that's on Myrtle Street, huh? Mr. Carboni, yes, sir. The lights are out. We'll take care of it right away. Thank you for calling, sir.
We all need our elected officials working for us. Be sure to register to vote today. For information, contact your city hall.
I love that clip. The reason why, I was a selectman in Stoneham, and one of my colleagues, and I'm going to date myself, Representative, 27 years ago, said to me, I got a call in repairing a pothole or something, and a colleague said to me, and I was a new guy on the board, I was only elected by a couple of months, and I'm going to conquer the world. I'll fill every pothole, put every stop sign up. And so I went to the chairman and I said to him, Mr. Chairman, I've got a pothole over on Main Street that one of the taxpayers, I didn't identify them as voter, taxpayers wanted repaired. He says, do they vote? I said, I don't know if they vote. He said, well, go check. I said, well, why would I check? The taxpayers, they have a hole in their street, they want it fixed. He said, if they don't vote, he says, we'll get to it eventually. If they're voters and they're active voters, he says, we'll be there tomorrow morning. The true story. True story.
That's right.
That is a clip that I enjoyed because of that reason. Representative, I'm sure that you deal with all constituents and you deal with them even-handedly. And I think the vast majority of the professional political people do that. It's sort of old school to service. You know, I ran for Congress and I said, if I'm elected, I'll be representing everybody, Republicans included, because that's the way I operated. Very even. But when you do vote, there is a benefit of being recognized that in fact, there's a super voter list. I know there's a list out there.
That's right.
It's called super voter list.
Super voters.
And it's identified by the state Democrat. I'm sure the Republicans have a super voter list.
Right.
And those are the people that get all the oil. Isn't that the truth? When you're running for office, Representative, tell me the truth here. Do you really focus on the voters, or do we abandon some of the independent voters who maybe don't even participate in primaries? And I'd like to get to the independent voters too. I'd like you to tell me, and I recognize, I'll play the independent voter role. I'm good at that anyway. And I have 3 Democrats and a Republican, and I'll be the independent. I don't want to vote in a primary because what is it? What's there for me? And I stay away from the primary. I vote the general election. Am I doing something wrong here? Am I doing, I can go Republican or Democrat. I'm unenrolled. Am I doing something wrong being not involved in a Democrat or Republican primary? I want to give it to Frank. And Frank, should I be voting in the Republican primary as an independent voter, or should I wait and see what you Republicans cast my way so I get what my friend calls it, the table scraps from the primaries, okay? Give me your perspective, please.
Well, Paul, for a lot of reasons that panelists mentioned, you do want to participate in the political process, which means you do want to show up and cast that vote. And you can decide to cast the vote for the candidate you feel is best, or you can use the strategy, which I don't recommend, but it happens, where you could cast a vote for what you think will be the weakest of the candidates, so that in the general election, your candidate will come forward. That's not what I propose. But you do show up and vote. And from the perspective of the candidate, you're a very valuable person for the candidate, because you have not made a commitment to another candidate. So when you're the person that doesn't show up to the polls very often, we want to reach out to you, want to inform you, like we're talking about tonight, the reasons why it's important that you vote. And when you become engaged, hopefully you'll decide that we are the best choice for you, and if not, at least you'll be in the system. And I think all of us that are involved in politics want to make this a better government. And when it's a better government, we all benefit, no matter which side of the field that we happen to be playing on at that time.
Thank you. Chris, what do you think? I'm an independent voter, and you're running for state senate up there in Melrose and Stoneham. Should I bother coming out for you? I mean, you're a Democrat, I'm an independent, or should I wait and see what the system throws out there in the general election? How are you handling the independent voters, Representative?
Paul, everybody needs to vote. Everybody deserves to have their pothole fixed. Maybe if that chairman of the Board of Selectmen fixed that pothole, the person would feel that the political process works, and therefore, I suggest respectfully, get involved in the political process, because they see just the filling of a pothole being an accomplishment. Their voice is indeed being heard. Everybody must vote. It's the old adage, if you don't, you can't complain. You get what you deserve. Everybody needs to learn about who's in the race, Democrat, Republican, or an independent. It's up to the person running for that office to inform every person of every party what their position is. And if that, hopefully the voter will hear something that they can identify with, and therefore be inclined to go out and vote. We must not just look at the super voters. We must not just look at the Democrats or the Republicans. The independents are as worthy as the Democrats and as worthy as the Republicans. It is incumbent on anyone running for political office, not by their own initiative, not by their own attitude, not by their own way of campaigning, to start disenfranchising people as well.
So the independents are a very important group to candidates. Is that what you're essentially telling me, or they should be?
Hopefully, I feel that they are, and I think the majority of the people up in Beacon Hill do. But people are also very frustrated by the political process. We haven't been talking about that, and what they see happening down in Congress with the impasse between the Democrats and Republicans. And I hope we can somehow carry forward Dr. King's message about inclusiveness before the show ends, and how his message from Nashville, I thought it was Nashville.
Memphis, yeah.
How his message that night, how his message, down in Washington, is about inclusiveness. And that's what we need to be doing in this country. We shouldn't be alienating people. We should be able to reach across the aisle and talk to a Republican, talk to an independent, with the ultimate objective, of course, for the common good of everyone.
I think what we have to remember is that we're all Americans.
Right.
And regardless of perspective, point of view, party affiliation, remember, I'm an enrolled independent during this show. I have to ask, give me some history, if you would. It's Black History Month. Now, we go back to 1860, 1862, we still had slavery.
Right.
No rights.
None.
A Republican president, I'll say, Abraham Lincoln, worked very hard, joining the Democrats and pulling everybody together. A great movement to pass 3 constitutional amendments. The 13th, abolishment of slavery. The 14th, establishing certain rights. And the 15th is furthering those rights to involve everybody as equal. And the black community suffered for another 100 years. Because we said it, we put it down on paper. That was what the clip said. You know, you made a promise on paper. But it took Dr. King and another movement 100
get us
years
there.
later
To
to
get us
push
there.
for civil rights, equal opportunity, no discrimination, no segregation. I remember busing in Boston under Garrity, Judge Garrity. I'm sure we all are, I guess I'm young enough, I'm not sure, old enough to remember the buses going through South Boston. Now we come so far. There have been individuals that have assisted the movement of Black America. I call it the American Black History Movement, and that's what it's all about. Because once again, I'm going to remind the viewers, we're all Americans.
Right.
The black community has placed itself deep into the fabric of this country. If you know your American history, they've been there through fighting of wars, there's Civil War. And it wasn't Harriet Tubman, she was an individual who...
Right.
was
The
she
Underground
accused of-
Railroad.
Underground Railroad.
Underground Railroad.
And wasn't she a spy for the Union down... If
Right.
I remember, there was
That's
some
right.
talk
Yeah,
about
she
that.
was.
Accused
She
of.
worked
She's
for...
accused.
She was
That's
accused
right.
of that,
Yes,
or
that's right.
whatever. Black History Month, very important, making up a great fabric that we have here called America. And that's why we have to be together. There's no room, there can be no tolerance for discrimination, segregation, or any of that today. We've come so far. But let me ask this question. We've got a ways to go still.
You know.
What do you think? We've still got to get more of the various communities. In Malden, it could be the Asian community. Frank, I'm not sure in Boston, you're probably looking at diverse groups, getting them involved. And you're all over the state, you guys.
Right.
You know, bringing in the, you said Trinidadian, Haitians,
Right.
et cetera. We have a serious problem where inclusiveness, Representative, that's where the key is, including people. That's what Dr. King fought for. In a peaceful way, marching for rights, assembly for our rights. He said we should have the right to march for our rights. I think that was in the speech. And the work that has to be done, I'm glad to see that the Democratic State Committee, and I'm sure the Republicans are doing much of the same, are moving the ball up the field, trying to get inclusiveness, get more people in the system in the process. It's healthy. What else have we missed here this evening? Because we've talked about the movement, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, I think was another name that comes.
Right.
Tell me about Frederick Douglass from back in the 1800s.
Wait a minute, weren't you alive?
Representative, be careful. I could ask you the same question. We're about a year apart in age.
Well, one of the things I think that you kind of overlooked is that we recently, when in the congressional race that you were involved in, we were asking each candidate to think about the Voting Rights Act.
Right.
That was due to run out. We were looking for making sure that the people who got elected to Congress focus on that, because it's a disgrace that as African Americans that we have to have, you know, these an amendment extended every
every
so
year.
often,
Right.
so that we can protect our rights to vote. I mean, here we're in 2014. You know, that's disgraceful, but that is where we are. So we were making sure that each person running for that congressional seat, are you aware of, and we need your commitment to that. That's been a national push we've been working with the National Urban League as well as several other national organizations.
Urban League, NAACP.
Absolutely.
These organizations, that's right.
To take the lead on these things. So, when you're talking about, where we're at, we're still in the fight. That's where we're at, okay? We're also pushing to make sure that certain things, such as you have the voter IDs that's going on, the battle going on in different states, that people have to show an ID to go to vote, when some people don't have access to an ID, okay? So basically, you're limiting the rights of people to vote. And we know it's targeted at people of color, okay, predominantly, some students, but we know it's an attack on our right to vote that could swing elections in different states. So the fight's still on. It's not that easy. The fight is still on. It's kind of tough that we have to, get behind a candidate to make sure they win, but also protect the rights of people to show up and vote at the same time. But that's where we are.
And the two connected. That goes back to when I was mentioning about what resonates to particular voter groups. And that's the key thing. And one of the things that Tina pointed out is that when people look, particularly communities of color, and take the black community, one of the things we look at is what that particular person who's running or who represents us or who wants to represent us, where's your position? We're still in the fight. Are you willing to step in the fight with us? How committed are you? The Voter Rights Act. I mean, that's something that, just point out, is constantly there. It's a goalpost. It's a goal that we constantly have to keep. Every so often, we have to reaffirm that right. And that takes a group of people that represent you to be committed to actually say, I'm committed enough that I'm going to make sure that right, that you continue to have that right. And communities watch that. And that's one of the things that they look at as a gauge as to if I'm going to support you or not, or even if I'm even going to bother to vote. And this goes back to some of the things that Tia and I have to deal with when we sit down with community groups, is saying to them, what's in it for me? Why should I even bother voting for it? And that's something that they look at. That Voter Rights Act is one key crucial piece that they look at and they say, that means a lot. And if you're willing to support that, then I can see the necessity in voting.
I supported it, there's no doubt about that, but unfortunately the Supreme Judicial Court last June in 2013 struck down Section 4 of the Voters' Rights Act.
Exactly.
That's right.
And that was really a step backwards in my opinion. Unfortunately, they felt on a 5-4 vote that I think the 9 states that were outlined, southern states, obviously,
Exactly.
It didn't really matter any longer because we've come so far. I think the message here is we got a long way to still to go.
Absolutely.
And we're fighting the fight.
Right.
I'd like to digress for a moment and educate the audience a little bit about how in the past, even after the 15th Amendment, and for women on the 19th Amendment during women's suffrage, which was passed in 1920, Susan B. Anthony's birthday, incidentally, is this month, February 15th. Very big leader, and unfortunately, she didn't get to see. She died 15 years prior to the 19th Amendment being passed. They had things, and let's talk about this. Poll tax. Why was that there? To do what? Representative poll taxing, keeping people in the process or out of the process?
Of course, Paul, to keep people disenfranchised, to keep people out of the process. And I think history may be repeating itself with what has occurred with the voter right in the infringement that has been made, in particular since the Supreme Court case in that regard. I think your point is right on target. It's like the goalpost is getting moved backwards. You're on the 1 yard line or you're in the end zone, only to realize that you got another 50 yards to go. It is a very serious problem. You would hope that, given the struggles, given the Civil Rights Act, and just our Constitution, that these problems would be a non-issue, and they're not. And for that, we should be we should be very abashed of the
Good
people
point.
we elect.
Absolutely, but there again, let me be the devil's advocate for a moment. The people we elect, providing you vote, providing you go out there and cast your ballot. Frank, you had an idea you were coming up with. I was hoping you were going to go back to Abraham Lincoln, that famous Republican president that helped pass the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to our Constitution, ensuring equality and involvement and inclusion in our process. Tell
We
me.
have some difficult chapters in our history, Paul, but if we were to look historically at the Republican Party can stand very firmly on the foundation of civil rights and for advocating on behalf of those disenfranchised individuals. So we're going to agree with the same outcome, although we may look at this process differently. Personally, I believe the states have a lot of rights. So when we talk about this voter right, the repeal of the voter right, that doesn't mean you as a voter can be prohibited from voting. That's not what it implies. What it does say is the state is the first barrier that can set those boundaries. And if the state does anything that prohibits you from voting or is an impediment for you to vote, you still have that constitutional protection. You can bring that case forward, but it allows the states to get control of the voting, which is where the Constitution was set up.
But that process, see, and
No, I think what I said is correct, that you still can bring the 14th Amendment challenge under the Constitution.
But in the midst of an election, when you have a hotly contested or heated election, particularly when you're talking about a presidential election, suing, because you have a lot of organizations that are in different states. They have a legal challenge in place. Legal challenges take time. Elections occurring in the interim. And by the time that these legal challenges are addressed, somebody is already sitting in the seat. I mean, let's look what happened with Bush versus Gore, okay? Legal challenges, I hear what you're saying. Unfortunately, they take time. And by the time that it is all said and done, we still may have the wrong person, unfortunately, sitting in the seat. What we need is an open process. I mean, if people need to be respectful of the fact that not everybody has access to the things that we think that we take for granted, okay? I do have an ID, okay? To me, walking in and showing my ID is not a problem. But when I hear that people are born in, like the elderly who are born in rural locations, that they did not have, they couldn't go down when they were born. They couldn't walk into an office and just register. It's so rural that they don't have access to these things. People need to think about that. People need to think that these people they want the right to vote.
It's a big country.
That's exactly right.